It was the year 2005 when a passerby was walking along a canal in Ireland when at a point, him and some group of people who were fishing saw what looked like a mannequin with a socks at the feet floating on top of the water body in the canal. At first, they didn't think much about it, but on moving closer to know how this mannequin had been disposed of in that body of water, this passerby would come to a terrifying realization on what was right in front of him. The story that led to what more groups of people would later witness or hear would lead to one of the most grotesque and macabre cases in Ireland's history. But before I get into this story, if you're a lover of disturbing, dark and mysteriously spooky true-life horror stories, then you might consider subscribing, turn on all post notifications, and consider liking the video if you find such stories interesting. And with that said, let's get straight into today's story. When Farah first came to Ireland in December 1996, he claimed to be a Somalian called Shalila Said Salim and whose family had been killed in the city of Mogadishu during the Somali Civil War. But the truth was that Farah was actually a Kenyan who had taken the route from Kenya to Rome and then to Dublin. He was reportedly born in 1967 with a wife and 3 children. Having trouble providing for his family, he had left his home country in search for greener pastures. On the 30th of December 1996, he would reach the Ireland border and changed his name on arriving at the Dublin airport. There, he told the Irish immigration authorities on how his life was in danger and hence had claimed to be a Somalian national seeking political asylum from war-torn Somalia. He made it known that he'd be given refugee status, which of course was later granted to him under the name Farah Swaleno. Farah's family back home believed that he had travelled for greener pastures and, as expected, would return to them in a few years' time. But for Farah, his true intentions were never to come back home. During the older times in Kenya, where Farah Noor was born and lived before coming to Ireland, women were treated as second-class citizens. Wives were subjected to obey their husbands, being beaten regularly. Children, especially girls, do not receive full education, and girls were subjected to mutilation of their genitalia, being classed as unclean. It was in such an environment that Farah grew up in before moving to Ireland, where he regularly kept in contact with his family, while also helping them financially. In 1998, Farah, who was in his early 30s at the time, would later go on to date and eventually marry a 16-year-old girl not long after arriving in Ireland. And with the parents of the girls not raising any objections to their daughter marrying a man who was twice her age, the girl became pregnant early in the relationship, and after the birth of their son in March 1999, the girl dropped out of school and moved in together with Farah. It's always said that the true character of a man eventually reveals itself. For Farah, his character was nothing good to behold, and for the little girl, this man she willingly married would soon come to be a living hell for her. The girl's parents believed their daughter had married an ideal gentleman, but behind closed doors, Farah was possibly every woman's nightmare. At the time, Farah worked on and off for an agency, but he spent most days as a serious alcoholic and dabbling in drug use. Friends also reported him as being a violent person, but even more violent and abusive when under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The more violent he got, the more he saw an opportunity to physically abuse the girl he called his wife. Of course, as usual with such a domineering attitude from Farah came the will to control and own her. Always reading through her text messages, listening to her phone conversations and monitoring her every move. Later, the family would find themselves in financial difficulties and a roommate would be taken in. Hence, the living expenses were shared. For Farah's young wife, Having someone else who wasn't his abusive partner to hang out with made her very happy. Also believing that while living with someone else, that Farah wouldn't lay his hands on her again. It worked for a while. The physical and emotional abuse stopped, but it didn't last. As Farah's drinking worsened, his efforts to hide the abuse no longer became a concern, and with the new roommate witnessing her young friend's maltreatment in the hands of her husband, she also couldn't bear it and had to leave, also advising X to do the same. But for X, despite her parents' support, not having enough skills to find gainful employment made it difficult to leave Farah, and she was ashamed to report the abuse to her parents. Even after the roommate left, X still kept in contact with her old roommate. But one day, she decided that the suffering was enough, including the death threats she constantly received from Farah. She disclosed the abuse to her parents, who immediately intervened. It wasn't long before the girl's father helped her pack out and she stopped living with Farah. Of course, a daughter being alive was better than staying in an abusive relationship with the unending hope that a partner changes for good. Their marriage had only lasted for 2 years, but a failed marriage was better than ending up dead. X was granted sole custody of the baby. She also got a restraining order against Farah, who retained visiting privileges. Being the dreadful and controlling man he was, Farah was of course upset because X had left him. In retaliation, he would start to harass her. He would continuously stalk her and always made sure to cause trouble whenever X was either alone or in the company of friends. Farah was so hot and angry that disturbingly, he decided to use his own child as a weapon against X when he now discovered that his now ex-partner was starting to see someone else. He started abusing the boy as well. After Farah's abuse had been reported by the parents of the girl, then came the order from the Irish Department of Justice, Equality and Law Reform to deport Farah, not just because his real identity had just been discovered, but because throughout his few years of living in Ireland, he already had 4 previous convictions for offences including intoxication, threats, assault, and of course his abusive behaviour. In 1997, he had assaulted a mentally disabled 16-year-old Chinese girl who later gave birth to his son. And as a result, in 1998, he became a father. 2 other women, one of whom was X, also bear his children, and they had also been physically abused and sexually assaulted by him. Not just that, Farah had also faced 8 charges of disorder and assault, one involving essay, in which a knife was found at the scene. While living in several areas in Dublin, he was convicted on 3 occasions, but never served time in jail. Farah had also boasted about killing a Dublin teenager called Renee Murray, becoming a suspect in her unsolved murder, but was ruled out due to lack of evidence. Coincidentally, Renee Murray went to school with one of Farah's ex-girlfriend's friends. He was a man described as being particularly violent towards women. He looked upon women as objects rather than individuals with personalities. In spite of all this, he appealed the deportation order, which he later won. And being a father to Irish children meant that he couldn't be deported. He had also put in an application for an Irish citizenship in March 1999. However, suddenly, thankfully, and for no apparent reason, Farah disappeared from X and his baby's lives. But this was because he found another victim. In 2002, Farah was in a nightclub with his friends, drinking and having fun, when his attention was drawn to a beautiful woman across the dance floor. The woman, who also noticed him, was marveled to see Farah walk over to her, where he immediately struck a conversation. Farah, being a gentleman on the surface, complimented her and made her feel as if she were the only woman in the room, and they got to know each other a little bit. That would be the beginning of Farah's romance with a then 51-year-old Kathleen Moohar, a woman who was more than 10 years older than Farah. Kathleen had 6 children, 3 male and 3 female, with her husband, a man by the name of John Moohar, who was violent and cruel to her and the kids. After being married for 29 solid years, Kathleen finally discovered John's infidelity. But as a stay-at-home mom, she couldn't just get up and leave him. Despite being miserable, she stayed, fearing she wouldn't be able to provide for her family. With her grown-up daughters, she began to party, drink excessively, and frequently visited the nightclubs in Dublin. It was there that she met Farah, who showed her so much affection that she knew she was treasured in his eyes. Kathleen didn't hesitate to enter into a relationship with this man, which is especially understandable as she was no stranger to abuse, having experienced it at both her parents' and ex-husband's hands. Even throughout their many years of living together with her husband, several reports were filed with authorities about domestic violence. Kathleen knew her marriage to John was very toxic, and after threatening to reveal his dirty secrets and calling the police on him, her now ex-husband John would leave after refusing to leave initially. Right after leaving, Farah would move into Kathleen's home, who at the time was still living with 2 of her children. With the aftermath of forcing her partner out of the home, Kathleen's children became furious with her and would let her move out to go live with their father, with the exception of one, a young woman by the name of Charlotte. She was the only one of her 6 siblings who sided with Kathleen because of her deep love for her mother. It was while living with her newly found love, Farah, would this man slowly reveal his true character. To her horror, she would learn that Farah was a violent alcoholic, a nice compassionate guy in the morning, and a completely different person once the drinking starts. At the early stages of their relationship, Kathleen thought it was best to relocate to a new area for a fresh start after realizing that most of her family wouldn't talk to her any longer. So they moved to Cork, a city which was 2 hours drive from Dublin. While in a new city, Kathleen had hoped to sell her marital home so she and John would divide the proceeds equally. But John didn't want that, so he moved back in with the kids. While in Cork, Kathleen had hoped that things would improve, but that was very far from her reality. The situation worsened, if anything, and without any witnesses, Farah increased the intensity of his abuse. Although Kathleen stayed at home, Farah was able to find a job in Cork and would lock her in the bedroom while he was at work, only letting her out when he got home to prevent anyone from seeing the bruises and injuries she suffered at his hands. All day long, while being locked up, Kathleen would lie in bed contemplating what had transpired the previous evening that had led to Farah's temper. When her wounds were too bad, and sometimes having fractured ribs and unclear vision, she would secretly leave the house to visit a doctor while lying to the doctor that she had been robbed. Kathleen thought that maybe the beatings would stop if she just changed and tried not to make him angry when they were drinking. Farah may have treated her like garbage, but she still loved him. The tumultuous relationship carried on for 2 years before both lovers would eventually return to Dublin in 2004. Like Farah's first wife, ex, Kathleen had hoped to see Farah discover his softer, more caring side. But after a few drinks, the old aggressive Farah would always emerge. One day, while on a night out celebrating, Kathleen and Farah would get into an argument, and Farah began punching Kathleen as they stood on the pavement. The cops were fortunate to observe the incident, as this would come to be the first time Farah had done it in broad daylight, and he was doing it just as a police patrol car was passing by. The police immediately detained Farah, despite Kathleen's pleading with the officers to release him. She flat out refused to talk to the police or provide a statement, even though the island police had just witnessed Farah physically beating her up. But they were powerless to intervene and were ultimately forced to release him. But as expected of men with such nature and character, it's safe to say that Farah may not have learnt his lessons. The abusive relationship never stopped, and reportedly as a couple, both drunk in public streets, argued and constantly shouted at each other aggressively. It was said that their social norms and values were different to the majority of society. Kathleen's older daughter was Linda, who dropped out of school at an early stage and later became a mother of 4. Just like her mother, she also suffered domestic abuse at the hands of her partner. But the relationship with the father of her children broke up, and she got into another relationship with a man by the name of Wayne Kinsella, who was subsequently jailed for 7 years for physically abusing the children. All 4 of Linda's children would later be taken into care, and after her partner was convicted, Linda got back custody of her children. But just like their mother Kathleen, she wasn't a perfect mother herself, as she was addicted to the use of heroin and had a history of alcohol abuse, just like her younger sister Charlotte, who also abused alcohol and drugs, and in the past had a number of convictions for minor criminal offenses. Charlotte was also involved in prostitution and had introduced her mother to it, which Kathleen engaged in from time to time. By all accounts, it was a family that was submerged in violence, abuse, and substance intake. Disaster was always lurking around the corner, and it was just a matter of time before it struck. It was the 17th of March 2005, a special day known as St. Patrick's Day, a day to remember Ireland's patron saint. Kathleen and Farah had celebrated the day in style. That Thursday, Farah's employer had caught Farah as he failed to show up for work. Kathleen had answered the phone, explaining that Farah wasn't able to come to work as he was caring for his sick child. This was untrue. Instead, both couples had been drinking throughout the celebrations. On the weekend of St. Patrick's, which was on the Sunday, the 20th of March 2005, Kathleen and Farah were wandering about Dublin city centre when they phoned Charlotte and invited her to join the fun. Charlotte's 22nd birthday was coming up and she was happy to participate in the festivities. A 30-year-old Linda was also invited, but Linda wasn't excited about going, and so Charlotte had to guilt-trip her into it so they could celebrate her upcoming birthday. Charlotte would go to fetch her sister Linda, but by the time they had arrived to join their mother and their lover to celebrate the day, Kathleen was already drunk, while Farah was totally wasted. The group would walk around the city, where they bought more vodka, coke, and were also taking ecstasy tablets. While still drinking around the city, a minor event would trigger an argument, and upon their return to Kathleen's apartment, the ladies decided to do more ecstasy, without Farah's permission or knowledge, after he had allegedly initially refused to take the pill. Kathleen crushed a pill, which she laced with Farah's vodka so that they might all share the same high. It was a drug-fueled night, as all 3 ladies, including Farah, went on a series of alcohol and drunk binging, while feeling an increased energy, pleasure, warmth, and a sense of euphoria throughout the night. However, this very night, something different would happen. Over 10 ecstasy pills had been consumed between the 4. 10 days later, a man who was just passing around the Royal Canal in Dublin spotted what he assumed were mannequin legs with a sock on the end of it floating in the water. But on moving closer to see how this mannequin ended up there, what this passerby had just seen would draw the attention of some people around the city, who gathered after rumors had been circulating around. Their morbid curiosities got most of them to discover in horror what they were looking at. The Gardaí, which is the National Police Force of Ireland, were called to the scene, and the police, on their arrival, found a sack containing garments and then started taking photos of the clothing they had just found, and then these pictures would be released to the public. with the authorities hoping that someone would recognize the owner of these clothing. Divers would also go into the canal and retrieve 7 pieces of these mannequin-looking objects in black plastic bags. The Gardaí would also put appeals in newspaper with reward money for anyone who could at least give information on the owner of the Irish soccer jersey or any other information that could help with identifying who this victim was. On the 9th of May 2005, so over a month later, while these pictures were still circulating, a seemingly minor breakthrough came in. A Muslim man by the name of Muhammad Ali Abubakar, who was a member of the African community in Ireland and also a Somalian, came to inform the police authorities in Dublin how on March 20th, so on the weekend of St. Patrick's Day, he had seen Farah, Kathleen, Charlotte and Linda together around the city, while recalling how he saw Farah wearing a white Irish soccer jersey on that weekend, and how the four were all in high spirits on the day he saw them. With the statement this man was giving, the police knew they now had something to work with, or at least where to start from. After this statement was taken from Mohammed, the Gardaí brought in Kathleen, including her 2 daughters, Charlotte and Linda, and began to question the 3 ladies. What the police were asking these 3 ladies was where Kathleen's lover, Farah, was. Immediately, these 3 ladies flatly began to deny having any information about Farah's whereabouts or what has happened to him, and with Kathleen saying that she had dated Farah for 3 years, so basically she knew him, but after a while, Farah had just packed his belongings and left her in March of 2005. The police, after a long interrogation session, dismissed all women, as there was nothing to suggest they knew about the disappearance of Farah. But as days passed by, Linda, the mother of 4, would phone the police and told them the whole truth. It would turn out that she had been having internal struggles and drinking daily to reduce her anxieties. She could no longer bear the feeling which was weighing her down, and when the police came over, they took a voluntary statement from her. The 3 women would also be arrested, before later being temporarily released on bail. A month after the 3 ladies' initial questioning and release, and days after Linda's confession, Kathleen would also suddenly disappear from Ireland, with no one knowing her whereabouts. So the authorities began working with the 2 daughters as their mother couldn't be found. With Linda's confession, both her and her younger sister would appear for their initial trials. The following is a graphic narration of what happened to both Farah and Kathleen that ultimately led to their disappearance. Mind you, the details are very graphic and horrific. The 4, after meeting up to celebrate St. Patrick's Day at the Dublin city centre on the weekend of St. Patrick's Day, would embark on a series of binge drinking on vodka, getting drunk and wasted. After a day of outing, as the foursome made their way to Kathleen's apartment, Kathleen would lace Farah's drink with some amount of ecstasy pill before serving it to him, doing so without his knowledge. That night, while still in Kathleen's apartment, Charlotte was perched on the arm of the 2-seater couch where Linda and Farah were seated, when Farah, who was now understandably in a state of euphoria, began making sexual advances on Linda, touching her in a sexual way while whispering dating into her ear, before wrapping his arms around her and refusing to let her go. Linda, of course, did not like this, and Charlotte, who was so protective of her older sister and her mother, angrily warned Farah to leave her sister. But Farah wouldn't listen. As they argued, Kathleen, who saw Farah making an aggressive pass on her older daughter, began yelling at Farah, who wouldn't budge, before she walked up to get a knife and a hammer and handed it over to the daughters, before allegedly telling both to just kill him for me. Without hesitation, Charlotte grabbed the Stanley knife and slashed across Farah's throat with it, knocking him to the ground. Farah was able to stagger into a downstairs bedroom before Linda took a claw hammer and began to hit him over the head many times, while their mother, who gave the order, watched from the sidelines but did not join in the attack. That evening, Around 27 stab wounds would be inflicted on Farah by Charlotte using the kitchen knife. He succumbed to his death after receiving serious injuries to his internal organs and other soft tissues, which included the heart, liver, stomach, and bladder. To finish it off, Linda and Charlotte took his lifeless body onto the bathroom floor, with Linda taking the top half of the body into the shower while running the water as she hacked away the head until it completely separated from the torso. Less than 2 feet away from Linda was Charlotte, who sat on the toilet seat while using a hammer and the knife to dismember the legs. Within 5 hours, Farah's head, limbs and genitals were completely chopped off, after which the limbs and torso were packed in 8 parts in black plastic and sport bags. He was dumped in the nearby Royal Canal in Dublin, taking the 3 women a few trips or days to do this. And to avoid Farah from being identified, they had also decided not to toss his dismembered head into the water. Back at Kathleen's apartment, the house was thoroughly washed and bleached, leaving the area where Farah's blood had spattered to be purely cleaned. Some days later, while casually strolling around the city, CCTV footage would show the 3 ladies eating breakfast rolls and with Farah's head still in a bag on Linda's shoulder. Then by means of a bus ride, and with Linda still carrying the severed head in her son's school bag while sitting as a passenger, the head was taken to a memorial park, which was just a bus ride away from where they lived. Then that night, they walked to a spot in the park where Charlotte had dug a hole with a knife and buried Farah's head, while Kathleen dumped the knives and claw hammer they had used into a nearby body of water. They then quickly left the area. Of course, to them, nothing has happened. Over the following days, the women would regularly walk to the areas they had dumped the body parts to visually inspect and make sure that the body parts remain sunk under the water. But of course, over a week of submerging the body parts underwater, the strength of the water waves eventually brought some of the bags containing the body parts above the surface of the water. It was 10 days later, after the brutal murder, when a group of passerby saw what looked like the arms and legs of a mannequin in the canal from a distance. But on a closer look, what they saw revealed it to be a human hand and leg with a sock at the end of it sticking out of the water. They were shocked when they discovered that they had just found human remains, and which was already whitish from decomposing. But what later horrified the people the most was when they discovered that the corpse had no head, after divers had recovered 7 parts of the remains. The discovery drew a lot of attention, and the media who were present to document the scene had also casually captured Kathleen and Charlotte near the scene. At the time, they were just Irish citizens who presumably looked shocked like the rest of the people who discovered the brutal dismemberment. The whitish nature of the body had also made the investigation longer, as the Gardaí thought they were looking for a white victim, not until his DNA suggested that it was a black male. While in the canal, they had also found a sack containing garments which the police took photos of the clothing and released to the public, hoping that someone would recognize it. After a few weeks had passed from Farah's body being discovered, Linda still had the nagging sensation that Farah's head would be discovered. Just a day after the discovery, she returned to the park where they had buried it earlier and dug it up, then wrapped Farah's head inside a bag and moved it to a temporary location where she later returned again a day later to dig it up, and moved to another park where she began to smash the skull into pieces. She then put some of the pieces in a plastic bag before leaving the remainder in the original plastic bag it was first stashed in. Having consumed too much alcohol, she eventually passed out before waking up that night to dump the skull and hammer into several garbage cans within the city. Farah's resting place was believed to be in a landfill. Unfortunately for these women, even with how they had improvised their cover-up in a bloody, spontaneous and brutal attack, Farah's friend, Muhammad Ali Abubakar, had seen Farah earlier with them in the days leading to his disappearance. What also made the identification to take longer was not only due to the fact that the Gadi had only the remains without a head, but also the absence of a fingerprint data. Farah was an immigrant before November 2000, when no immigrant was fingerprinted in Ireland. Since he arrived in 1996, fingerprint identification proved difficult. Therefore, forensic isotopic analysis was used for the first time in Ireland in 2005 to identify the remains found in the Dublin Canal. This analysis looked at the diet, geographic location, and isotopic composition of human tissue, which was mainly used for archaeological purposes before this. On learning that Farah had 3 children from 3 different women, Farah's DNA and the DNA of one of his children from one of his previous relationships was also tested to prove that the child had been fathered by him. Kathleen, who later moved out of the apartment after Farah's death, possibly due to the haunting imagery of what they had done, even made their situation more suspicious. When in August 2005, after Linda's confession, the flat in Summerhill was searched, and using a chemical substance known as luminol, which detects the presence of old blood or blood that has been cleaned up, bloodstains were found all over the bedroom. There were traces of blood on the walls, the carpet and furniture, which later matched Farah's DNA after DNA profiling was used to compare the DNA found on his decomposing body. All the obtained DNA information, along with the identification of some sticky flesh in the white Irish soccer jersey found on the body, positively identified the body to be that of Faris Wallenor. Police detained Kathleen, Linda, Charlotte, and John Moohar, Kathleen's ex-husband, including John's 2 sons, who threw their father under the bus, saying that he was involved in the body's disposal, when in fact he had nothing to do with it. However, he was aware of the murder and chose to remain silent. It would turn out that the ladies had caught John on the night of the murder and asked him to help disposing of the body, which he allegedly said he refused to do. So without any solid proof, John and his 2 sons were all set free from Farah's case. During the investigation, a 21-year-old Charlotte allegedly informed police that her 30-year-old sister Linda was covering up for their mother Kathleen, while saying that Kathleen had played the bigger role and they were just minor assistants. Now, the police, being given different conflicting accounts, suspected that Linda was speaking the truth, so they focused their efforts on Charlotte. But ultimately, Charlotte would be convinced to come clean after being warned that lying would only make it worse for Linda. In September 2005, a month later, Kathleen would also go missing and her whereabouts were not known. What happened to her would bring about a second investigation. In December 2005, so 2 months later, Charlotte and Linda were charged with murder, and John Moohar, the father of the 2 daughters, who became devastated about the unfortunate circumstances that had befallen his family, decided to take his own life, hanging himself from a tree in a public park within the city. After his death, he was ruled out as a suspect in the case. After the confessions, the trial was scheduled for October 2006, and during their trial, the judge would describe the case as the most grotesque killing that had occurred in his professional lifetime. After being found guilty of murder, Charlotte was given a mandatory life sentence, while Linda was found guilty of manslaughter, since the court saw her involvement in the killing as minor, after she defended her case due to provocation. She received a 15-year prison term. In January 2008, so 2 years after Kathleen's sudden disappearance, the true story of what happened to Kathleen would be revealed following the second investigation. After Linda, her daughter, came clean and had given the police her voluntary statement, Kathleen had been secretly making arrangements before she fled to the United Kingdom in September 2005 to hide away from the crime they had committed. She wasn't found again until it became known that she was living in England. She voluntarily returned to Ireland in February 2008 and, among other offences, was charged with 2 counts of giving false information to the police about Farah's whereabouts, withholding information which she knew or believed would be of assistance in prosecuting her daughters for the brutal killing. She was also charged with impeding an arrest in the murder investigation. In February 2009, a year after her return to Ireland, Kathleen would plead guilty to helping to clean up the crime scene to conceal evidence. And in May 2009, so 3 months after pleading guilty and 15 months after her return to Ireland, she would be sentenced to 5 years in prison. But she would eventually serve only almost 2.5 years of her time, as she would later be released in October 2011. Linda Moohar will eventually serve 12 years of her sentence and became a free woman in January 2018. Following her release from prison, Linda's daughter would praise her mother for, in quotes, taking a dirty rapist off the streets, and describing Farah as a murderer and a woman beater who was not going to get away with assaulting another woman on the night of his demise. According to the daughter, he messed with the wrong woman. Even years after Linda's release from prison, she remained estranged from her mother, Kathleen, as Kathleen knew that Linda blamed her for the brutal killing and dismemberment of Mr. Farah. Even though Kathleen, who escaped and left her daughters to fight for themselves during their court trials, later held herself responsible, while also adding, "It would never have happened if I had never met that man." Linda is currently living in the UK following her release from prison and has no plans to return to Ireland. It's understood she wanted to stay in England so she can keep a low profile, allowing her to start a new chapter in her life and leave her criminal past behind. While still in prison, Charlotte believed that among the 3, she never deserved the longer sentence, as she felt Linda did more on that horrific night. According to a letter written by her, what happened on that night went a bit out of control. She regretted and apologized for what she did, admitting that the horrific crime still gives her nightmares. She also rubbish claims that she killed Farah Noor because he made a pass at her sister, a claim which a 37-year-old Linda originally made during her prison interviews. Whether this was true or not, only these 3 ladies could actually tell. Instead, Charlotte insisted that the only reason she had savagely killed Farah was because her mother had told her that he had threatened to kill her, and hence, instead of waiting for Farah to kill their mother based on that threat, they had decided to kill him first. Charlotte would also later say that she realized that her mother's several lies and actions while in the relationship might have been the reason why she received several beatings from Farah, and her mother, she believed, should have gotten a life sentence. "I hate being called the Scissor sisters. It makes me out to be the monster," she wrote. As of the time of making this video, as one of the tentative steps towards Charlotte's ultimate permanent release from prison, she had been kept under supervised day outings to see relatives since the latter half of 2022, and her day release keeps on running till this day. Though her official release date has not yet been determined, it is said that if she continues to behave herself, she may be freed in the first few months of 2024. And while the average life sentence in Ireland is between 18 and 19 years, so far she has spent 17 years in jail for the murder conviction. Also, as part of the process to rehabilitate her, it also included signing on and notifying the authorities always about where she lives, and failure to do so or even committing any other crime meant that she would be returned to jail. In Ireland, the heinous and gruesome nature of the incident attracted a lot of media attention and public interest on a daily basis due to gruesome details involved. As a result, the media dubbed the sisters the Scissor Sisters, after the New York-based music group in America. Ever since then, the family have been notorious in Ireland, though some still have some sympathy for these 3 women whose lives had been ugly and blighted for years. The Moohar's family behavior was a horror story born out of dysfunction, being no strangers to violence, abuse, and criminal activity throughout their lives, which ultimately led to an explosion of bloody violence.